We are living in a time of urgency. Everywhere we look, the signs are impossible to ignore. The air grows heavier, the oceans warmer, the forests thinner. Headlines speak of climate change, biodiversity collapse, plastic-filled seas, and extreme weather that once seemed unthinkable. Scientists warn us, activists march, governments debate, and yet, despite all our knowledge, all our technology, all our warnings, the crisis deepens. But let us pause for a moment and ask a more uncomfortable question. What if the real problem is not out there? What if the rising temperature of the planet is only a reflection of something burning within us? Because if we look carefully, we begin to see a strange pattern. Humanity has never been more advanced. We have more tools, more information, more efficiency than any civilization before us. We know how to produce clean energy. We understand ecosystems better than ever. We are capable of incredible innovation. And yet, despite all of this, we continue to consume at a rate that is destroying the very systems we depend on. Why? Why do we keep taking more than we need, even when we know the consequences? Why do we continue to chase growth, expansion, and accumulation, even when it leads to imbalance and suffering? The answer, from the perspective of Buddhist psychology, is both simple and deeply unsettling. It is craving. In the ancient teachings, craving, ta, is identified as the root of suffering. Not just personal suffering, but the entire cycle of dissatisfaction that keeps beings trapped in endless becoming. And today, if we look honestly, we can see that this same force is not only shaping our inner lives, but also our entire global system. Modern society is built on craving. Every advertisement you see is designed to awaken a sense of lack within you. It whispers, "You are not enough, but you could be, if only you had this." Every scroll on social media is carefully engineered to keep you wanting more attention, more validation, more stimulation. Every upgrade, every trend, every new release feeds into a subtle but powerful illusion that fulfillment lies just one step ahead. Just one purchase away, just one achievement further. And so we chase. We chase not because we are evil, not because we are ignorant, but because we are conditioned. Conditioned to believe that happiness is something to be acquired. Conditioned to feel incomplete without constant consumption. Conditioned to measure our worth by what we have, what we show, what we become. But here is the paradox. The more we consume, the less satisfied we feel. The more we accumulate, the more we fear losing. The more we chase, the further peace seems to slip away. This is not a failure of individuals, it is the nature of craving itself. Craving does not end when it is fulfilled. It grows. It multiplies. It adapts. It turns satisfaction into a temporary pause before the next desire arises. And when this psychological pattern is scaled up to billions of people, reinforced by economic systems that depend on continuous growth, it becomes something far more dangerous. It becomes ecological destruction. Because the earth is not being destroyed by need. It is being destroyed by excess. Not by survival, but by endless wanting. Not by what we require to live, but by what we believe we must have in order to feel complete. We cut down forests not because we need every tree, but because we crave expansion. We pollute oceans not because we cannot live without plastic, but because convenience feeds our habits. We extract, produce, discard, and repeat, not out of necessity, but out of momentum driven by desire. And so, what we call a climate crisis is, at a deeper level, a manifestation of a much older and more intimate crisis, the crisis of the human mind. This is what makes the situation so complex. Because if the problem were purely technological, we could solve it with innovation. If it were purely political, we could negotiate solutions. But when the root lies in the very structure of how we experience desire, identity, and satisfaction, then no external solution alone will be enough. We cannot solve a crisis of craving with more consumption. We cannot heal imbalance with the same mindset that created it. This is why, despite decades of awareness, change feels so slow, so fragile, so inconsistent. Because we are trying to fix the symptoms without addressing the cause. We are treating the environment as separate from ourselves, when in reality, it is a mirror of our collective state of mind. And this is where the ancient wisdom of the Buddha becomes not just relevant, but urgently necessary. Because over 500 years ago, long before industrialization, long before climate science, there was a deep understanding of a simple truth. That suffering arises from craving, and that freedom begins with seeing this clearly. If we apply this insight today, we begin to see something profound. The environmental crisis is not just an environmental issue. It is a psychological issue. It is a spiritual issue. It is a reflection of how we relate to experience itself, how we grasp, how we resist, how we endlessly seek fulfillment in things that cannot provide it. And so, the question is no longer just, how do we save the planet? The deeper question becomes, why do we keep destroying it, even when we know better? Because until we understand that, until we turn inward and observe the subtle movements of craving within our own minds, any solution we create will remain incomplete. This is not a call for guilt. It is not about blaming ourselves or others. It is a call for clarity. To see that the same force that makes us check our phone compulsively, that makes us want just one more thing, that makes us feel restless even in moments of abundance, that same force, when multiplied across humanity, shapes the fate of the earth itself. And if that is true, then something equally powerful must also be true. That the transformation of the world begins not in distant policies or technologies, but in the quiet moment when a single craving is seen, understood, and not followed. Because in that moment, something shifts. The cycle pauses. The momentum weakens. And a different way of living becomes possible. This is where our journey begins. If craving is the hidden force shaping our world, then we must go deeper. It is not enough to say, desire is the problem, and leave it there. Because craving is subtle. It does not always appear as something obvious or dramatic. In fact, most of the time, it hides behind what feels completely normal. It feels like preference. It feels like ambition. It feels like comfort, improvement, progress. And that is why it is so powerful. In the teachings of the Buddha, craving, is not a single, simple urge. It has many faces, many layers, many disguises. But traditionally it is understood in three fundamental forms. The first is the craving for pleasure, kamata. This is the most familiar. The desire for enjoyable experiences, for beauty, for taste, for comfort, for stimulation. It is what makes us reach for the phone when we feel bored, what drives us to buy things we do not need, what pulls us toward endless entertainment. Endless novelty, endless distraction. There is nothing inherently wrong with pleasant experiences. The problem is not pleasure itself. The problem is the attachment to it, the belief that we must hold on to it, repeat it, increase it. And because pleasure is always temporary, craving ensures that we are never at rest. As soon as one experience fades, another must take its place. And so the cycle continues. The second form is more subtle, bhavata, the craving for becoming. This is the desire to be someone, to become something, to construct and solidify an identity. It is the quiet voice that says, I need to be more successful, more respected, more complete. It is the force behind endless self-improvement, not always from wisdom, but often from a deep sense that who we are right now is not enough. This craving does not only consume resources, it consumes our peace. Because no matter how much we achieve, the feeling of not yet remains. The finish line keeps moving. The identity is never stable. And so we build and build and build careers, images, lifestyles, hoping that one day it will finally be enough. But it never is. The third form is perhaps the most misunderstood, vibhavata, the craving for non-existence. This is the desire to escape, to avoid, to get rid of what we do not like. It appears as distraction, as denial, as numbing. It is what drives us to suppress uncomfortable emotions, to run away from pain, to silence anxiety not by understanding it, but by covering it with stimulation. And in modern life, this form of craving is everywhere. We scroll not because we are interested, but because we want to escape. We consume not because we need, but because we want to forget. We fill every empty moment not because it lacks value, but because silence feels uncomfortable. So craving is not just about wanting more. It is also about not wanting what is already here. And between these two movements, grasping and rejecting, our entire experience is shaped. Now, here is where it becomes even more important to understand. Craving does not arise randomly. It follows a pattern. A deeply conditioned, almost invisible sequence that unfolds moment by moment within the mind. In Buddhist psychology, this is described through the principle of dependent origination, paikāsamupta. And within this chain, there is a crucial link we often overlook. It begins with contact. Something is seen, heard, felt, thought. Then comes feeling, not emotion in the complex sense, but a simple tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And from that feeling, craving arises. Not after long reflection. Not after conscious decision-making. But almost instantly. Automatically. A pleasant feeling arises, and the mind says, I want more. An unpleasant feeling arises, and the mind says, I want this to stop. A neutral feeling arises, and the mind says, this is boring, find something else. And just like that, the movement begins. Craving leads to clinging. Clinging leads to action. Action leads to patterns. And those patterns become habits, lifestyles, systems, eventually shaping not just individuals, but entire societies. This is how something as small as a momentary feeling can scale into something as vast as global consumption. Because we are not consuming based on need. We are consuming based on feeling. This is why logic alone cannot solve the problem. You can know that you do not need something, and still feel compelled to have it. You can understand the environmental cost, and still find yourself clicking buy. You can be aware of the consequences, and still repeat the same patterns. Because craving operates beneath rational thought. It lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the conditioned responses that have been reinforced thousands of times. And modern systems are designed to amplify this. Every notification, every advertisement, every algorithm is carefully tuned to trigger feeling, to create small waves of pleasure, dissatisfaction, curiosity, or anxiety. Not to inform you, but to move you. To keep the cycle going. And so we find ourselves in a world where craving is not just a personal challenge, it is an economic engine. Entire industries depend on it. If people were content, many systems would collapse. If people felt enough, the demand for endless production would decrease. If people could sit with discomfort instead of escaping it, entire markets built on distraction would lose their power. This is why understanding craving is not just a spiritual exercise. It is a radical act of awareness. Because when you begin to observe this process directly, when you see how a simple feeling turns into a desire, how that desire turns into an impulse, how that impulse seeks expression, you begin to step out of the illusion that, this is who I am. You begin to see that craving is not self. It is a process. A conditioned movement. Something that arises, changes, and passes, if it is not constantly fed. And this is where a profound shift becomes possible. Because if craving is a process, then it can be understood. And if it can be understood, then it does not have to control us. But before we move to how that transformation happens, we must fully recognize the depth of the pattern we are in. Not intellectually, but experientially. To see that every unnecessary purchase, every restless scroll, every moment of dissatisfaction is not isolated, it is part of a larger system. A system that begins within the mind, but extends outward into the world. And as long as this engine of craving continues to run unchecked, no amount of external change will be enough. Because we will simply recreate the same patterns, in different forms, with new technologies, under new names. The forms may change, but the force remains the same. And so the question is not whether we can eliminate craving completely, all at once. The question is, can we begin to see it clearly, in the moment it arises? Because in that moment, before it turns into action, before it becomes habit, before it shapes the world, there is a small but powerful space. A space where awareness can enter. And in that space lies the possibility of freedom. If we look deeply enough, we begin to see that nothing exists alone. A forest is not just a collection of trees. It is a living network: soil, water, sunlight, microorganisms, insects, animals, all interwoven in a delicate balance. Remove one element, and the entire system begins to shift. Disrupt enough of these relationships, and the system collapses. This is what we call ecology. But what if I told you that the same principle exists within your own mind? What if your thoughts, emotions, reactions, and habits are not isolated events, but part of an internal ecosystem, an ecology of mental processes that constantly influence and condition one another? Because when we begin to observe carefully, we realize something profound. The mind is not a solid entity. It is not a fixed self, sitting behind experience. It is a dynamic field, constantly changing, constantly responding to conditions. A feeling arises because something was perceived. A thought arises because of a memory, a belief, a prior reaction. A reaction arises because of conditioning built over time. Nothing appears independently. Everything is connected. This is the principle of interdependence. In the natural world, we see it clearly. But in the mind, we often miss it. We take each thought personally. We identify with each emotion. We believe, this is me, this is mine, this is who I am. But from the perspective of deep insight, what we call mind is more like a flowing system than a fixed identity. It is an ecosystem of causes and conditions. And within this ecosystem, craving plays a very specific role. It is not just one element among many, it is a destabilizing force. Just as an invasive species can disrupt a natural habitat, craving disrupts the balance of the mind. It amplifies certain patterns, suppresses others, and gradually reshapes the entire system. When craving is strong, attention becomes narrow. We focus only on what we want or what we want to avoid. The richness of experience is reduced to a simple binary, desirable or undesirable. And from this reduction, imbalance begins. We ignore what is essential and chase what is stimulating. We overlook what is sufficient and pursue what is excessive. We disconnect from reality and become trapped in projections. And this internal imbalance does not stay contained within the mind. It expresses itself outwardly. Because the way we perceive the world determines how we act within it. If the mind is driven by craving, the world becomes something to be used, consumed, controlled. Nature is no longer seen as a living system we are part of, but as a resource we can exploit. Other beings are no longer experienced with empathy, but through the lens of utility, what they can give us, how they serve our desires. This is how inner ecology shapes outer ecology. Greed within becomes exploitation without. Restlessness within becomes overproduction without. Disconnection within becomes environmental destruction without. And yet, from another perspective, there is no true within and without. Because the air you breathe, the water you drink, the food you eat, all of these are part of the same interconnected system. Your body is not separate from the earth. Your mind does not exist independently of the conditions that shape it. You are not standing outside the ecosystem. You are the ecosystem. And this realization changes everything. Because if we are part of the system, then harming the system is, in a very real sense, harming ourselves. Not as a philosophical idea, but as a direct consequence of interdependence. But more importantly, it also means that transformation is possible. Just as a damaged ecosystem can recover when balance is restored, the mind can also return to equilibrium when its underlying patterns are understood. And this brings us to a crucial shift in how we understand sustainability. Today, sustainability is often framed in external terms: reducing emissions, conserving energy, protecting biodiversity. These are important, absolutely necessary. But they address only one side of the equation. Because if the inner conditions that drive overconsumption remain unchanged, then any external solution will be temporary. We will find new ways to consume, new ways to exploit, new ways to recreate imbalance. True sustainability must include the ecology of the mind. It must ask not only, how do we reduce harm to the planet? But also, what are the mental patterns that create harm in the first place? And when we begin to explore this question, we see that sustainability is not just a technical challenge. It is a psychological transformation. It is the gradual shift from unconscious reactivity to conscious awareness, from compulsive craving to understanding, from disconnection to interbeing. Because when the mind sees clearly, when it understands the interconnected nature of experience, it naturally begins to act differently. Not out of obligation, not out of forced discipline, but out of insight. When you truly see that chasing endless pleasure leads to dissatisfaction, the urge begins to weaken. When you truly see that grasping creates tension, letting go becomes natural. When you truly see that you are not separate from the world, care and responsibility arise effortlessly. This is not morality imposed from the outside. This is harmony emerging from understanding. And this is why the concept of ecology of craving is so powerful. Because it reveals that what we are dealing with is not just a behavioral issue, but a systemic one, an interconnected web of causes that spans both mind and world. To heal such a system, we cannot attack individual symptoms in isolation. We must understand the whole. We must see how a single moment of unexamined craving connects to patterns of consumption, how those patterns scale into industries, how those industries impact ecosystems, and how the resulting environmental changes, in turn, affect our minds and bodies. It is a loop, an ongoing cycle of interdependence. But within this cycle, there is also a possibility. Because just as small disturbances can create imbalance, small moments of awareness can begin to restore balance. A single moment of seeing clearly, of not following a craving, of not reacting automatically, may seem insignificant. But in the ecology of the mind, it is like introducing a new condition into the system. And conditions shape outcomes. If enough moments of awareness arise, the system begins to change. Patterns weaken. Habits shift. Perception deepens. And from that shift, new ways of living become possible. Not forced. Not artificial. But aligned. Aligned with reality. Aligned with interdependence. Aligned with the natural balance that both the mind and the world are capable of. So when we speak of ecology, we must expand our understanding. It is not only about forests, oceans, and climate systems. It is also about attention, perception, and desire. Because the same laws that govern the balance of nature also govern the balance of the mind. And when we begin to see this clearly, we realize something both humbling and empowering. That the path to healing the earth and the path to understanding the mind are not separate paths. They are one and the same. If craving is the force that drives imbalance, and if the mind is an ecosystem shaped by conditions, then the question naturally arises. Is there a way to intervene? Not by force. Not by suppression. Not by replacing one desire with another, but by understanding the system so deeply that its patterns begin to dissolve on their own. This is where mindfulness enters. But we must be careful here, because the word mindfulness has been used so widely, so casually, that it has almost lost its depth. It is often presented as a technique for relaxation, a method to reduce stress, or a tool for productivity. And while it can do all of those things, in its original sense, mindfulness, sati, is something far more radical. It is not about controlling the mind. It is about seeing the mind. Seeing clearly, precisely, without distortion, without interference. Because the problem is not that craving exists. The problem is that craving operates unseen. It arises, it moves, it shapes our actions, and we follow it automatically, as if it were our will, our identity, our intention. We say, "I want this," without ever questioning where that wanting came from, how it formed, whether it will lead to anything lasting. Mindfulness interrupts this blindness. It does not stop craving from arising. It does something more subtle and more powerful. It reveals it. Imagine for a moment that you are about to reach for your phone. There is no clear reason, no urgent need. Just a slight restlessness, a small discomfort, a quiet pull. Normally, the movement is immediate. Hand reaches, screen lights up, attention is captured. But with mindfulness, something different happens. The movement slows down. You begin to notice the feeling itself, the subtle unease, the urge, the anticipation. You see how the mind is projecting relief into the act of checking, how it promises satisfaction before anything has even happened. And in that moment of seeing, a space opens. A space between impulse and action. And within that space, something remarkable becomes possible. You do not have to follow. This is the beginning of freedom, not the elimination of desire, but the end of automatic obedience to it. Because when craving is seen clearly, it loses part of its power. It is no longer hidden. It is no longer unquestioned. It is experienced as a process, arising, intensifying, and if left alone, eventually fading. This is something you can observe directly. A desire arises. It feels strong, urgent, almost necessary. But if you do not act on it immediately, if you simply watch, it changes. It shifts. It weakens. Sometimes it disappears entirely. And when you see this happen, not once, but many times, a deep understanding begins to form. You begin to realize that craving is not as solid as it seems. It is not permanent. It is not you. It is just a movement in the mind. And this understanding changes your relationship to it. You no longer feel compelled to satisfy every urge. You no longer believe that every desire must be fulfilled. You begin to experience a different kind of stability, not based on getting what you want, but on not being controlled by wanting. And from this inner shift, something unexpected happens. Your behavior begins to change, not because you are forcing yourself to be more sustainable, but because the underlying drive that led to excess is no longer as strong. You consume less, not as a rule, but as a natural consequence of clarity. You choose more carefully, not out of guilt, but out of awareness. You pause more often, not because you are told to, but because you see the value of not reacting immediately. This is what we might call an ecological intervention at the level of the mind. Because instead of trying to fix the outer system directly, you are altering the inner conditions that give rise to it. And when those conditions change, the system begins to shift on its own. This is where ethical living, sila, emerges, not as a set of imposed rules, but as an expression of understanding. When the mind is less driven by craving, simplicity becomes attractive. Not as deprivation, but as freedom from unnecessary complexity. Non-harming becomes natural. Not as a moral obligation, but as a recognition of interdependence. Responsibility arises. Not as pressure, but as clarity about the consequences of action. And perhaps most importantly, contentment begins to appear, not the fragile satisfaction that depends on external conditions, but a quiet sense of enoughness that does not need constant reinforcement. This is something modern culture rarely speaks about. Because a system built on craving cannot easily accommodate contentment. If people felt deeply satisfied with what they already have, many of the mechanisms that drive consumption would lose their force. But from the perspective of liberation, contentment is not a limitation. It is a profound form of wealth. Because when you are not constantly pulled by desire, Your energy is no longer scattered. Your attention is no longer fragmented. Your actions are no longer reactive. You begin to live with intention. And this has real, tangible effects. You buy less, but you value more. You move slower, but you see more clearly. You engage more deeply, but with less attachment. And when enough individuals begin to live this way, the impact extends beyond the personal. Because systems are not abstract, they are made of people. And when people change, systems follow. Not instantly, not dramatically at first, but gradually, steadily, like an ecosystem adjusting to new conditions. So mindfulness is not just a personal practice. It is a quiet revolution. A revolution that does not rely on force, but on understanding. That does not demand perfection, but invites observation. That does not promise immediate transformation, but offers something more sustainable, a shift at the root. And this is why even a small moment of awareness matters. Even noticing a single craving before acting on it is not insignificant. It is the beginning of breaking a pattern that may have been repeated thousands of times. It is the introduction of a new condition into the system. And as we have seen, conditions shape everything. So the next time a desire arises, whether it is to consume, to escape, to grasp, there is no need to judge it, no need to suppress it, no need to follow it blindly. There is only an invitation to pause, to observe, to understand. Because in that simple act, something shifts. And in that shift, the cycle begins to loosen. Not all at once, but enough to open the door to a different way of living, one that is not driven by endless craving, but guided by awareness, balance, and a deep respect for the interconnected world we are a part of. If we have seen clearly the nature of craving, if we have understood how it shapes both the mind and the world, and if we have glimpsed, even briefly, the possibility of stepping out of its cycle, then a new question begins to arise. What would life look like if we were no longer driven by it? Not completely free, perhaps, not yet, but less controlled, less compelled, less entangled. What would a human being look like who is not constantly chasing, not constantly resisting, not constantly becoming? Because for most of us, the identity we carry is built upon these movements. We are taught, from a very young age, to become someone. To achieve, to accumulate, to define ourselves through what we do, what we own, what others think of us. The world rewards this identity. It celebrates ambition, consumption, expansion. It tells us, again and again, that more is better, that bigger is success, that faster is progress. And so we grow into this role. The consumer. Not just someone who buys things, but someone who experiences life through the lens of acquisition. Always reaching, always upgrading, always searching for the next improvement, the next version, the next step. But beneath this identity, there is a quiet tension. Because no matter how much we gain, it never quite settles. There is always something missing, something incomplete, something unresolved. And so the movement continues, not because it fulfills us, but because we do not know how to stop. Now imagine, even for a moment, that this movement begins to slow. Not forced, not suppressed, but naturally through understanding. Imagine that instead of asking, "What else do I need?" the mind begins to ask, "What is already here?" Instead of, "What can I become?" It asks, "What is this experience right now?" Instead of, "How can I get more?" It asks, "What happens if I do not follow this desire?" And in these subtle shifts, something profound begins to emerge. A different kind of identity, not built on lack, but on awareness. The conscious being. This is not a mystical idea. It is not something distant or unattainable. It is simply the state of being present with experience as it is, without immediately trying to change it, control it, or escape it. And from this presence, a new way of living unfolds. You begin to see that you do not need as much as you thought. That many of the things you once considered essential were actually responses to restlessness, to insecurity, to habit. You begin to feel a quiet sufficiency, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer measuring your life against endless desire. And this changes everything. Because when enoughness is felt internally, excess becomes unnecessary externally. Consumption slows. Not as a sacrifice, but as a natural consequence of clarity. And when consumption slows, something else becomes possible. A different kind of society. Not one built on endless growth, but on balance. Not one driven by competition for more, but guided by understanding of what is enough. Not one that exploits the earth as a resource, but one that recognizes itself as part of a living system. This may sound idealistic, but every system that exists today was once an idea. And every transformation begins not at the level of the whole, but at the level of the individual. Because systems are sustained by patterns of behavior, and behavior arises from the mind. If the mind remains unchanged, the system will recreate itself, no matter how many reforms are introduced. But if the mind begins to shift, even slightly, the system must eventually follow. So the question is not whether the world can change. The question is whether we are willing to look deeply enough to see what must change within us. Because this is where true responsibility lies. Not in blaming corporations, governments, or others, though they play their role, but in recognizing that the same patterns we see on a global scale also exist within our own daily lives. The same craving that drives industries is present in the small moments of wanting more, wanting different, wanting escape. And this is not something to feel guilty about. It is something to understand. Because guilt does not liberate. Understanding does. When you see clearly how craving operates, when you experience directly how it arises and passes, when you realize that you do not have to follow it every time, a quiet confidence begins to grow. A confidence not based on control, but on insight. And from that insight, a new relationship with life emerges. You begin to engage with the world, not as something to take from, but as something to participate in. You begin to act, not from compulsion, but from clarity. You begin to care, not because you are told to, but because you see the interconnectedness of all things. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to experience a kind of peace that is not dependent on circumstances. A peace that does not require constant stimulation. A peace that is available even in simplicity. This is the foundation of a truly sustainable life. Not one that is held together by effort and discipline alone, but one that flows naturally from understanding. Because when the mind is no longer burning with craving, the world is no longer experienced as something to be consumed endlessly. It becomes something to be lived with, something to be respected, something to be understood. And in this way, the question of saving the planet begins to transform. Because the Earth, in its vast intelligence, has always been capable of renewal. Ecosystems recover. Life adapts. Balance, given the right conditions, reemerges. But the human mind, caught in cycles of craving, identification, and becoming, requires a different kind of healing. Not technological, not external, but deeply internal. So perhaps the real work of our time is not only to protect the forests, the oceans, the atmosphere, but to understand the forces within us that lead to their destruction. Because when those forces are seen clearly, when they are no longer blindly followed, a new possibility opens. A possibility where action is guided by wisdom rather than impulse. Where living is guided by balance rather than excess. Where the human being is no longer just a consumer in a system, but a conscious participant in a living world. And this is the invitation of 2026. Not a demand for perfection. Not a call for sudden transformation. But a quiet, persistent invitation to see more clearly. To pause more often. To follow less automatically. And to discover, in the space that opens, a different way of being. Because in the end, the greatest ecological revolution will not be found in policies or technologies alone. It will be found in the moment when a human being sees a craving arise, and chooses, gently, not to follow it. And in that moment, however small it may seem, the future begins to change.